This is episode 7 of Youthful Perspectives. I'm your host, Mason Beerbaum. My guest today is Professor David Hacker, a demographic historian from the University of Minnesota with an emphasis on 19th and 20th century census data. His research is currently focused on 4 topics: the demographic costs and consequences of the American Civil War, the long-term decline of fertility between 1790 and 1940, the demographic behavior of immigrants in the early 20th century, and the impact of racial residential segregation on child mortality. His work has received notable awards like the John T. Hubble Prize for the best article published in Civil War history, and the Dorothy S. Thomas Award for the best paper on the interrelationships among social, economic, and demographic variables. These distinguished accolades are one of the many ways Professor Hacker has furthered our understanding of the past, so we may be better prepared for the future. During our conversation, Professor Hacker and I covered a diverse range of topics, like the unique history of demographic transitions, societal changes from the Age of Enlightenment to technological advancements during the Industrial Revolution, and the recurring pattern of history's interconnectedness to itself and how it's shaped our world today. I hope this conversation teaches you as much as it taught me, and now, here's Professor Hacker. Well, thank you, Professor Hacker, for joining me today. Let's get right into it, first with a brief overview of your background.
Sure. I am a historical demographer. I've been here for the last, about 12, 13 years, but I have a very atypical path of becoming a historian. I started my undergraduate career was as an engineer, a process control engineer in the pulp and paper industry, and I worked in that field for a number of years, maybe about 10 after graduating from Miami University in Ohio with an engineering degree, and got the history bug. I was reading history books on the planes and read a book by James McPherson on the American Civil War, and I thought, I'd like to give this a try. So I applied to some programs, talked to a number of programs, and they weren't too impressed by my background as an engineer. But one historian pointed me to the University of Minnesota here and says, you've got a lot of math ability, and that's rare among historians. And there are a few places that kind of specialize in what was called quantitative history, and maybe you consider getting a degree from there. And that was the University of Minnesota here. We had a number of quantitative historians here on the staff back when I started in the 1990s. I started here in 1993. I got my degree in 1999. Then I went to work for a number of universities. I worked at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena for a couple years. Then I worked for 12 years at SUNY Binghamton. It's upstate New York, State University of New York school. And that was a fabulous place to be. It had a graduate program. We trained graduate students. And I started as an assistant professor and got tenure there. And back in 2013, the University of Minnesota had still been specializing in quantitative history this time and did a major search where they tried to bring in 4 demographers, people who do demographic history, which is my specialty. I applied for it and kind of came back home a little bit, if you will. Although I'm originally from Ohio, this is now home.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. So that's kind of what brought you all back to the University of Minnesota. Well, that's great. Well, you said demography is your specialty, and so our conversation today is centered around that, and particularly the long 19th century, as it is called.
Yes.
But before we jump into that, what is demography and why is it important?
Well, generally speaking, demography is the study of human populations. Its growth, its change over time, its distribution, the processes that lead up to changes in population size and distribution. The processes usually, actually, maybe the best way to introduce it is a classic population balancing equation, which I teach my students, and that is the population at any given place at any moment in time is equal to the population at some previous point in time, plus the number of births that it had occurred between the past and the present, minus the number of deaths, plus the number of in-migrants, minus the number of out-migrants. And so those are the processes that lead to population change: births, deaths, and migration. And so core demography, if you will, study those processes. Now, there are a number of specialties that build out from that. There's a number of subfields, like social demography is interested in questions of race, ethnicity, marriage, and family structure. These things that lead to changes in births, deaths, and other things, right? Economic demography, study of labor force and the kind of classic economic theory, and then historical demography, study of demographic change in the past is what I do.
So it seems like demography encompasses a variety of things, whether it be like social factors, economic factors, just overall history. I mean, it's kind of the cornerstone for a lot of things throughout time. And it's been something that's been occurring since humans first existed.
Absolutely. The growth and survival of the human population, everything that impinges upon that, I guess, yes.
And then within demography, there's these things called demographic transitions. And I was wondering if you could just discuss what demographic transitions are and perhaps explain the 4 phases.
Sure.
And I guess there are supposedly 5 now. They're starting to add, but the 4 main ones, and then perhaps a little bit on the 5th one.
You're obviously talking about classic demographic transition theory. Let me just say, generally speaking, for most of human history, there was relatively little change in population behaviors. There's long periods of very slow demographic growth, and we think of these periods as kind of having a demographic regime. There's a logic to them, where human populations do not grow too fast to overrun resources in an area, and so these long moments of a demographic regime punctured by changing demographic behavior, which we call transitions, right? Mm-hmm. And there's been a number of them, fewer. 3 or 4, depending on how you count. Some with the Neolithic transition, kind of agricultural transition, industrial transition, and other things. But the one that occupies the most attention among historical demographers and people today is what we call the demographic transition, and that is the transition from, in Europe, it starts about the late 19th century, from a demographic regime where there were high death rates, we could consider high death rates, high birth rates, to a very short period of time, relatively slow economic growth, to transition to a period of low birth rates and low death rates. Again, in balance, but that's a really rapid transition occurs in a period of about half a century, after most of human history having what I'd call high birth and death rates. And so that transition itself you can break into different stages, which I think you were referencing here. Mm-hmm. And the first stage of the demographic transition, and classically it would be this high rate, the balanced kind of regime that seemed to be the case for hundreds of years. Birth and death rates about 40 per thousand, 50 per thousand population. Mm-hmm. The next stage is the beginnings of mortality decline, where humans finally get the capacity to understand their environment enough, disease enough, to make some changes and we could talk about the causes of this later here, but to bring mortality rates down and life expectancy, the converse, up. And as a result of that first stage, or second stage, if you will, the demographic transition, population starts growing very rapidly. So much so that within a generation or so, couples start practicing birth control, which is really revolutionary new human behavior, and birth rates start to decline. And so in that third phase, if you will, population growth rates start to decline again. And in the fourth stage, we come back to this balance of fairly low birth rates, fairly low death rates. Now, fifth stage, you mentioned sometimes we can talk about a second demographic transition, a relationship between migration and population growth that becomes quite interesting. But yeah, that period of demographic growth is just revolutionary in terms of what it means for human history.
Yes, and it seemed, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said for the most part in human history it was that first stage of the transition where for thousands of years, humans were in that high birth rate, high death rate, low life expectancy.
That's correct.
And that wasn't until the 18th century, you're saying, is when it started to transition?
Maybe in France,
Okay.
in some place late 18th, but really 19th century for me. I mean, there are other kind of transitions beforehand, and the move to agriculture and settled towns that occurs many centuries before was also associated with population changes. Actually, death rates probably went up from the kind of hunter-gatherer populations, had relatively lower mortality, but very relatively lower fertility because they're nomadic and on the move. And when humans started farming, occupied one place, sedentary populations, we do see an increase of disease, but we also see an increase in fertility. So there is a transition early we know much less about, but the big transition, yes, late 19th century to early 20th century.
And that's an interesting thought, too, is with those nomadic tribes, which for people that aren't familiar, it's tribes that move from place to place, like the Mongols, historic example of a nomadic tribe. The more kids you have, the more you increase in your population. That's one more mouth you have to feed in a very finite amount of resources that you have access to. But also when you mention when agricultural revolution happens and you just see those cities start popping up here and there, you get a big group of people in one small area, which leads to the vulnerability of disease, like you mentioned too. So you kind of get both ends of the stick here when it comes to that. Okay, well that's good to know as we go throughout this conversation here. Looking back, there's a variety of famous demographers throughout human history, but arguably one of, if not the most famous one, some would say, is Thomas Malthus. So could you just give a brief overview on who Thomas Malthus was?
Yeah, Thomas, you consider a founder of demography. Maybe I could go back just a little bit earlier too, but let's just stick with Malthus for the moment. Writes an essay in 1798, an essay on population, he calls it, that looks at the relationship between population growth and environmental resources. So this is a foundational text where basically what he argues is that human population and animal populations in general have a capacity built in them for exponential growth. Mm-hmm. The idea is that if you're a couple and you have 4 children and they each have 4 children, etc., you can get very quickly ability of a population to outrun the resources to support that population. And so Malthus was interested in how are human populations held in check from this potentially really rapid growth. And he says it's held in force by what he called a positive check. And the positive check he meant was death, and disease, famine. It's a positive check. There's nothing positive about the positive check, I sometimes say, right? Mm-hmm. That basically human populations will hit some carrying capacity of the local environment and no longer be, through excess death rates, and that population's held in check. Malthus believed that humans could grow resources, but only at a really arithmetic rate, not an exponential rate. And so inevitably the human lot was misery. It would bump up against these kind of death rates. And in fact, people were kind of consumed by death rates. I could go back earlier than Malthus and think about one of the early founders of demography is John Grant, who in the 17th century was the first one. And there was bills of mortality in London, and he was interested in trying to estimate human life expectancy from them. And he developed kind of what we think of as the first life table showing life expectancy and mortality probabilities by age. It's really kind of revolutionary in the sense it's like he's saying there's a regularity to patterns of human mortality, which doesn't sit real well religiously, right? Yeah. Because God determines the timing and of one's death, supposedly, but yet Grant's finding a real regularity by age. And so the scientific study of population kind of begins at that point. There's long been history, of course, demographic interest in numbers of citizens, number of potential soldiers. They're, back to antiquity. But you start with Grant with the beginnings of modern demography, and then Malthus is kind of the key figure. Now, what's interesting is Malthus writes his, at least for me, because I'm a U.S. historical demographer, Malthus cites all the way through his essay as a kind of a foundational text is Benjamin Franklin's essay in 17. I think it's 54, 55, on the increase of mankind. And what Franklin was observing in colonial British North America was exponential population growth that Malthus says shouldn't be possible for long. But Franklin's saying, hey, look at this new continent, for at least Europeans, right?
Yep.
Aboriginal population decline was so rapid that not much of a resistance could be put up. I mean, some was, but not a lot. And so the European populations who arrived in North America were able to increase at an exponential rate. And he observed 35% growth per decade, which is like a doubling of the population every 20, 24 years. And he starts mapping this back in time and realizes, wow, at this rate, we're going to outnumber the people. There are more Englishmen on this side of the Atlantic than the other side of the Atlantic. Yeah. And it's holding. And in fact, holds all the way through, I think, about 1870, that the population increases 35% per decade. It's quite remarkable. It's the longest human sustained growth rates of that size in human history. So it's pretty fabulous. So Malthus sees this, and to him that's the negative example that proves the rule, if you will. If there is no environmental check, this is what human populations can do. But here in England, you don't have that land capacity. You're going to hit this check. I'm going on and on. You can stop me if I want.
No, keep going.
Malthus, in his subsequent editions of the book, it's interesting. He comes up with another possible check on human population growth, and he says, he calls it the preventative check. And he says, humans are different from other animals in that we don't quite wait until things are so miserable that we have excess death and famine, and people will sometimes adjust their behavior. And in particular, he noticed marriage in England was a check on population growth. It's kind of a cultural institution, marriage. And the assumption in England at the time was you had to wait to get married until you had acquired enough resources as a young man or young woman before getting married to form your own household. And as a result, people were getting married at 27, 28, 29 years of age, not this kind of notion of Romeo and Juliet at 12 or 13. That's fiction. Yeah. People were having to delay the start of marriage because they had to acquire enough resources, and that kept the population growth in check. Okay. So, and he laid this out, and in fact, it looks pretty convincing that there was a demographic regime held in check by marriage and mortality, which makes the demographic transition that comes afterwards all the more surprising.
So when it comes to marriage, people getting married in their mid to late 20s, that also with the social factors of people not having children out of wedlock to kind of suppress the birth rates from increasing, or had that check, like you said, and just other factors too, whereas like in the United States or the colonies at that time had so much more land at their disposal compared to the island of Great Britain, which finite amount of resources. Obviously, there's no infinite amount of resources, but when you come from England and you go to North America, it seems like it's an infinite amount of resources.
It does, and people did get married a lot earlier here in the United States. That explains some of the higher fertility, right?
Yeah.
So in England, where there would be 4 to 5 children per woman, in the United States it was 7 or 8 on average. So yes, there is of course some out of wedlock childbearing, and all societies do, but it is very strongly culturally controlled. And it's limited. So marriage is a way of kind of confining most sexuality to within marriage, not all, but most, and really puts a brake on population growth.
And do you think these like average family sizes differed in North America compared to Great Britain because there was more people farming, or there was more land to farm, and therefore you needed more hands on deck to cultivate the land compared to England, or what explains that significant difference in birth
I think
rate?
you touched on all of them. Yes,
Okay.
certainly they're farming in England,
Mm-hmm.
and the Industrial Revolution doesn't begin really till well, we can talk about that maybe circa 1800
Yep.
or so. And we're having much larger family sizes here prior to industrialization in England or elsewhere, and that is largely because people marry early. And yes, if you think about becoming the assumption, cultural assumption, is you had, we call it neo-local family formation.
Mm-hmm.
And English-speaking societies, before you could get married, you had to set up your own household. You wouldn't bring in your future husband or a future wife to live with you and your parents,
Mm-hmm.
right? You need to acquire your own farmstead.
Mm-hmm.
And so when land is inexpensive, very cheap, in the colonies, you can start that when you're quite a young man or quite a young woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's largely a result of that. So not so much conscious behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So transitioning now, we kind of are leading up to this main part of the conversation in the quote-unquote long 19th century. So that's an important part of understanding demographic history in the United States. And I was just wondering if you could describe what the long 19th century is, perhaps the dates that people throw out there of when it started and where it ended, and why it's important to demographic history.
Yeah, sometimes these historical centuries don't work as well when you're talking about social phenomena. And sometimes I like the long 19th century because I see a uniformity between, let's say, roughly 1780, 1790, and maybe 1930, more like a 150-year period. And the uniformity I see there is throughout this period, these high birth rates that I described earlier start to decline right about the late 18th century, and they continue declining all the way to like 1930s. Mm-hmm. This is a very slow moving for the U.S. Demographic transition, and in the 1930s we start to see the baby boom begin. Not post World War II. It starts a little bit earlier.
Oh, really?
So yes. So this period is kind of consistent in a way. On the other hand, massive changes. In the 1790s, the first census of the United States, and we count less than 4 million people. But as I said, it's doubling every 20, 25 years or so, such that by 1850 we have about 20 million people. By 1900, just under 100 million people. Mm-hmm. So it's just becoming a country that 4 million people huddled on the eastern shore to a continental country with massive urbanization, massive growth, industrial. It's really a transformative long century, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When you say at the beginning of this period, would you say the birth rates were what you said, 6 to 7 per family?
7, 8, maybe. Yes.
This is at the beginning too, and then what was? What the average life expectancy was at that beginning stage of the...
We don't know well. I mean, the data we have to use is kind of an estimate, but probably something like 40 years at birth. Now, if you survive your first year of life, your life expectancy goes up because the first year is one of the most hazardous. But it was probably about 40 years at birth in the beginning of this long 19th century. It's probably about 60 years afterwards.
And is it true, I've heard this through other people talking about this, it wasn't necessarily that people just lived to 40 and then they would just die at that age. It was more there's so many kids that would die in that first year of life, like you mentioned, and people aren't going to live to 90 or 80 years old, though it did happen, but it was more that early death in the first year or two of life that kind of shows that life expectancy being around 40 years.
You got that exactly right.
Okay.
And you think of it, a bimodal distribution of deaths.
Mm-hmm.
Almost I shouldn't say no one. I mean, people did, but there are very relatively, if you will, few deaths at age 40, where life expectancy is. There's more post 60 years of life. So if you look at the 20th century, where the biggest gains of life, where we have good data, come from, most of it comes from infancy and childhood. Okay. We are, older people are living a little bit longer, but not a lot, despite all our medical care, right? The big changes have been in infancy and childhood.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I just wanted to clear that up because you hear that throughout history. It's like in the Middle Ages, people lived at 30 years old, and it's like, how did people accomplish anything if they were living to 30 years old? So that makes more sense then.
Right.
So it's good to know. So we kind of talked about the stats when it comes to the beginning stages of it. We mentioned this earlier, but the Industrial Revolution plays an enormous role, not just America, but really Western Europe, the entire world in a large sense is affected by it. So could you just describe what the Industrial Revolution was and how it reshaped Americans' demographics?
Yeah, big question.
Yeah.
A short answer on the Industrial Revolution, of course, is the human capacity, learning to put energy use, steam in particular, in the early Industrial Revolution begins. I think of England as being the kind of the home here, where there's really massive jumps in knowledge about the use of steam power, and we see industrialization starting typically in the textile industries, but all industries are approached to where we can produce so much more output per worker. So this energy, use, coal-powered steam, ends up driving a lot of industrialization, and a lot of productivity increases drive from that. The productivity increases are in all fields. Actually, agriculture benefits quite a bit. And so what I think of it is in terms of it used to be that people grew all their own crops and made all their own things for their own home consumption. And with industrialization, suddenly there's a marketplace where you can specialize in a particular crop. You can use reapers and other things to increase your agricultural output. And suddenly fewer and fewer people are needed to grow the food necessary to feed the population, and more people can work in these kind of industrial jobs and even in service sector as well. So we see big jumps in real GDP, and we see less starvation. We see people growing in stature. It's really quite fascinating. Yeah. If you look at the height of soldiers and then the French and Indian War to the ones, and there people are growing taller. So there's better food, higher quality food, and that is part of what's leading to the beginnings of this demographic transition that's coming in the 19th century.
So the way I've kind of always thought about the Industrial Revolution is to look at the Agricultural Revolution, in the sense where in the Agricultural Revolution, you went from nomadic tribes to, growing together within a society or a community where agriculture is in an abundance. And when you have more people, or you have more people in an area that are focused on agriculture, but you have more productivity in that sense, people can specialize in other things, whether it's like blacksmith or, law, medicine, that sort of thing. So it almost seems like with the Industrial Revolution, that pattern repeats itself in the sense that, you have farmers who are more productive, then that can have people go out and study medicine, or they can study, science and other things too, which, as you've mentioned, would increase height statutes and other things, growing GDP, quality of life improves overall. So
that's well put. Yeah.
So it's sort of like a snowball effect in a positive way too, where it's just kind of building upon itself in a positive manner. Not to say there weren't issues during that time, there certainly were, but in the terms of like overall humanity.
Yeah. Certainly early industrialization might have, the really earliest parts, ends up driving heavy urbanization, and working conditions were not great. And in that first few decades, this probably has a negative impact on human health and longevity. But long term, the things you're talking about, the feedback loops, the specialization from trade, real GDPs increase at such a start. In the United States, which I know the most about, we see the most dramatic takeoffs of GDP growth. That's gross domestic product per capita after 1820. Things start really growing rapidly at that point. Now, probably, our best life expectancy estimates suggest that maybe there's a decline in life expectancy initially, because we get this urbanization helps spread disease. People are dying from disease here. We can talk later maybe about the epidemiological transition, which is related to the demographic transition. But disease is more easily spread as there is more urbanization and there's more movement of people. There's a transportation revolution alongside this industrial and agricultural revolutions, canal boats, railroads eventually, that leads to more movement of people, the greater spread of infectious disease. And so there's a hit there. But long term, these gross and living standards and knowledge, which we can talk about in a minute as well, ends up leading to this massive demographic transition that's coming.
Yeah, and I didn't really think about that beforehand, and how with increasing technologies you can have more interconnectedness with, whether it's the Europe or whether it's, Asia way out there too, and they bring all these cultures together, diversity with immigration as well, which is something we'll talk about too. You get different modes of thinking and different, whether it be food or just overall ideas.
Ideas. I mean, take something like smallpox inoculation, for example. It's something that begins, we think, in Africa. It's picked up by Cotton Mather in Boston because, it's something we think that his enslaved woman practiced. And it was kind of beginnings of people trying to fight infectious disease. And inoculation, you probably know, is taking some kind of pustules from someone who's had smallpox before, putting it under the skin of someone that has not been exposed to the disease. Ideally, they get a mild case and then become immune from the infection going forward. That's one of these early steps towards, and eventually Edward, with the smallpox vaccine, Jenner, I should say. I was having a freeze there in my brain.
No worries.
And these kinds of knowledges start growing, especially when we get to the germ theory of disease. And the spread of that comes from Germany, from England, from France, here to the United States. And the application of that theory is what we really start to see improvements of life expectancy and longevity.
Absolutely. So are you saying that it was smallpox inoculation was kind of developed by an enslaved woman, is what you said? That was observed by...
She brought the knowledge.
She brought the knowledge, and that was from Africa originally. Yep. So again, though that's a terrible way for interconnectedness to occur through slavery, nonetheless, it still spread knowledge in that way that helped the overall population. And currently right now I'm rewatching the John Adams HBO series right now, and I believe it's in the second episode. They have a perfect example of what you described. There's a poor very sick person in the back of this cart, and they go up to Abigail Adams' household, and they take a little bit of the pus, they do a slight incision on the arm, and then they do a small infectious transfer over with the germs, and some people have a mild reaction, some people very serious, and sometimes it resulted in death at the beginning stages.
You're taking a risk, there's no doubt. But think about what a revolutionary change in human behavior that is. I mean, for centuries, humans were pretty fatalistic towards death, right? God determines the timing.
Yeah.
And to suddenly intervene in a way, so it's quite fascinating. And there's a growing sense, if you, where does disease come from? Right? And there is some sense that there is some contagious diseases there. Not exactly sure what the pathways of contagion are, but, people can see things coming. Right, from city to city spreading, right? And then there's this more of the more classic case, this kind of more of environmental sense. It's the environment you live in, and particularly the air and the quality of the air. And so we live in places with bad air, bad ventilation. You're more likely to get malaria, bad air, these kinds of things. And so a lot of early effort was in sanitation, to get rid of odors. Yeah. But eventually, with germ theory that begins in the 1870s, 1880s, people start cleaning water, and that's where you get the real big impacts.
And the germ theory, too, you said stemmed from Europe, where there's Germany and France, England, and then that interconnectedness again,
Yes,
where you
absolutely.
get those transfer of ideas, too, which also was probably revolutionized by the printing press, but that's a whole other topic of discussion.
But all these things are related. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So the more we talk about this, the more it's like, the scientific revolution, Enlightenment theory, the Renaissance, it all kind of, antiquity, like you mentioned, too, it's all connected in one way or another.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Well, you step back. I think maybe it's time to take stock of this. How important, how transformative is this demographic transition?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you go back and think about what it means to human populations, going back to, let's say, 1800 or so, global population since then has increased by a factor of 6.
Mm-hmm.
It's 6 times larger than it used to be, and it's still kind of growing. We think it'll peak around, 2100 or so, right? So in a lot of that growth is elderly people. We have 50 more times more elderly people than we used to in 1800. Now we only have 5 times more children.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a real aging of the population. The past, based on the death rates and fertility rates of the past, the median person in the United States was probably less than 15 years old.
Yeah.
And now it's like 35.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that. It's somewhere in that. It's moving up.
Ballparking it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So real transformative.
And I had a conversation with another guest previously, and he talked about, I don't know too much about this field. He was just the messenger on this, but he said that there's technologies that's promising in the realm of aging, and there's, I guess, hypothetically, it's not out of the realm of possibility where people could live to 115, 120, even 130 on a pretty consistent basis with just the rapid growth in that field, technologically and just knowledge-wise too. So we'll see, like, when the population of older people, if that keeps going, then we'll see if those projections 2100 are
it's
true.
Really, there was an interesting article in Science about 20 years ago by Jim Oppen and James Vappell, and they went back and looked at forecast for what human life expectancy will be, because government's always interested in how much revenue do we need for Social Security and Medicare and these kinds of things. And the United Nations in particular and the U.S. government makes projections about population growth. And to make those projections, they have to project future life expectancy. And what Vappell and Oppen said is that every time that they drew these limits to human life expectancy, they were wrong. They were too conservative. So every year they would say, in 1920 they were saying life expectancy is going to, it's about 60 now, and it'll probably be a ceiling of about 70. And of course it blows right through 70, and then they draw a line at 75. And life expectancy has been going up year after year, well, except for COVID years.
Yep.
That's separate. But generally speaking, in the developed world, there's been no sign of slowing of life expectancy growth. And we, part of us rebels and say, well, it has to end somewhere.
Yep, exactly.
But it'd be interesting to hear what your guests had to say. So far, no sign of that.
Yeah, and it's the exponential growth of knowledge is the way I kind of look at it too. I always use the air travel as an example too. It's 1903, I want to say, is when the Wright brothers first had successful flight, and then by 1969 we had people on the moon. And just think of the growth in the technology with that, and if that could be applied to other fields, whether it be aging or you name it.
Right.
The possibilities truly are endless, it seems like.
Yeah.
But I just want to tie it back now to the long 19th century here. When you talk about immigration previously and how that's an important factor when it comes to demographic transitions and just overall demographic outlooks for countries, how did immigration affect the United States demographics during the long 19th century?
Well, I mean, we're a nation of immigrants for the most part. I mean, the American Indian population, of course, is the only Aboriginal inhabitants of this land. So obviously it's all the rest is immigrants or the progeny of immigrants. But most of the growth of the population, I said something like 35% per decade, probably about 2/3 of that is what we call natural population growth. That's more births than deaths, right? So immigrants make up maybe 1/3 of that. This country, through most of the long 19th century, had open borders. Of course, by saying open, it wasn't necessarily easy to get to. Most, you had to pay passage. So the immigrants tended to be somewhat selected by, they're not the wealthiest wealthy people in Europe, because those people stayed in Europe.
Yeah.
But they're not the poorest poor either, because they cannot afford to come. So we tend to get a selection of motivated people coming. They tend to be young people. They're in the workforce. They've been quite positive for the growth of the 19th century United States. And so they came in great numbers. The period, we think, the age of migration, where really steamships made the passage cheaper and easier, is something like 1880 to 1920, something like the great age of migration. And right at that point, around 1900, 1910, you don't quote me exactly on these numbers, but the country is almost 25% foreign-born. So the United States population. So, and if you think about the children of those foreign-born population, it's a massive percentage of the population is either foreign-born or their parents were foreign-born. So that's massive. At the same time, it creates backlash, as it does today to some degree. I think there's so much social change that happens so rapidly at points, and so we see backlashes occurring first against the Chinese population in the West Coast. So we see the first Immigration Exclusion Acts, 1880. I should have written this date down somewhere in there. Of trying to exclude Chinese migrants into the country, and then the big acts in the late 1910s and 1920s. I think it's 22. I should look these up before I start talking in a microphone.
It sounds about right, though. Yeah. There was more before that, too. I don't remember. I know, Irish immigrants were discriminated against, too, or Italians. It seems Jewish people throughout history have always been discriminated against in one form or another, and that was no exception. The Chinese immigrants as
I'd say most of our immigrants in the 19th century coming from Northwest Europe. So that is Great Britain, Germany, Ireland, and then are the big ones, Canada, I should say, as well.
Yeah.
Or if you kind of, then, of course, there's Scandinavian, there's every country's represented to some degree, but they're mostly Northwestern Europe. And it's not until around 1880, 1890 that you start getting the beginnings of more Southern European, Southeastern European Jewish migrants from Russia and other places that you start seeing that as well.
Was there certain factors within Europe at that time that kind of spurred people to want to immigrate over? I know you mentioned the income levels or just opportunity that was in America, whether it's through land or just the freedoms that we offered compared to others. Was there anything in particular that demographic historians point to as this happened and that motivated people to go over to the United States?
Something specific, maybe not, but we do have theories of migration, and one of the easiest to understand, the classic theory, is called push-pull migration, right? And that people decide to move when they envision they have a better opportunity somewhere else. So there's the opportunities are being that they see in North America. Maybe they hear from fellow countrymen that have been there before, and that is a pull factor. Opportunities, and then there are the perhaps difficulties, maybe population growth or lack of opportunities in their home countries, and we think of those as push factors, and those things combined. But I don't know if there's a real triggering mechanism. Certainly 1848 in Germany and some other things, there are these migrations tied the potato famine and obviously a push factor in Ireland in the 1830s and 40s.
Yeah, that seems like be a pretty clear mark in the sand right there, the famine in Ireland.
Yeah, but most of this is not so much triggering events so much as the combination of pull and push factors.
And it seems these pull and push factors still apply even today, whether it's from people like the influx of migrants from Latin and South America. People are either getting pushed or the pull factor of the United States, like the American dream. So it's interesting to observe that historically, and even today, even in Minnesota, there's a diaspora of Somali folks.
That's right.
And that's from the Civil War and this other factors, I'm assuming. And
it's interesting. Our percentage foreign-born is now starting to rise close to the levels we saw circa 1900, 1910, when there was that first backlash to migration.
Absolutely. And we talked about a little bit of this too, but the improvement of transportation seems to have an effect on demographic changes. Is there any particular innovations that come to mind where it's like, okay, this like significantly increased people migrating, or the demographics changing significantly?
Well, obviously it's a continental country, and if you look at how it was settled, that first push in across the Appalachian Mountains into Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee was a difficult one. It was done on foot and wagon, and it was fairly slow. But beginnings in with the Erie Canal in the 1820s was transformative in terms of the amount of produce it was able to get to market in New York along that canal. It's just that the canal it's difficult to say. Difficult to say to overestimate how important that is. And then, of course, there's turnpikes that are built, which make travel, because roads were terrible before this, muddy and with bog. And then, especially the railroad. The railroad is just transformative.
And did the railroad originate, was that in England where it first started, or Russia? I forget where it originated from.
I think it's England. It's to carry coal, but maybe you're right. But it may have originated there, but we end up having something like I should pull a number out of the air and don't go like the vast majority of the world's railroad mileage is here in the United States.
Oh, really?
In 1850, 1860. And it's not just that this railroad is taking people to where they can move. That's not the point. The point is to tie the marketplace together, to make it economically viable to set up a farm in Illinois and to get your grain to market in New York. That makes it those places become desirable, For a long time, this is a relationship with the Industrial Revolution. Think about Illinois, Minnesota too. I mean, Wisconsin, Iowa. A lot of these were prairie lands, and it was considered at first an American desert. Nothing could grow there, right? Because the sod is just so thick, and it looks like nothing's growing. People used to think it's fertility of the land is where there's lots of trees, but not the case. Some of the most fertile soil in America is here in the prairie lands, and it took an engineer, John Deere, with a steel-tipped plow. This is part of the Industrial Revolution, part of the agricultural revolution, to cut through that sod, turn it over, and find some of the most productive farmland in the United States. So you add that to the capacity to get your crops to market. That's what's pulling people to the Midwest. That's what's pulling migration and continued population growth. Because the East, by the way, is getting more densely populated. Fertility rates are dropping there in the 19th century in New England. Women are starting to have fewer kids. There's not great opportunities nearby. But on the frontier, people are still having huge families.
Yeah. And I didn't realize that John Deere was, I mean, that makes sense now that you say that, but like as a human back in the day, he created this revolutionary invention. Yeah. And that's, again, the transfer of knowledge and ideas that, like the printing press and literacy rates increasing, and then the growth of that. Education also levels in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, were pretty high compared to most areas in the world.
Yes, we have some of the highest literacy rates in the world, in New England. There's an emphasis on reading the Bible. Not so much the South, but in the North, absolutely. And it's interesting how this agricultural, industrial revolution is tied to demography long term, because the other big invention of the 19th century is the McCormick reaper. Which allows people to, harvest their crops in bulk and scale with less help. And the fortune that's built by McCormick ends up going to his widow, and she funds the first trials for the pill. She goes through Margaret Sanger in the 20th century, and that revolutionizes the human control of fertility in the 1960s. So these things are all tied over the long term.
They're all connected in one way or another. Another technological invention that comes to mind relating to agriculture is the cotton gin, if I'm not mistaken, and the implications that had for the institution of slavery within the American South, but which also existed in the American North, if I'm not mistaken, too, earlier on. But would you speak a little bit about how the institution of slavery shaped demographic patterns in the southern United States before the Civil War?
Oh, that great question. Yes. Well, let me back up and say this. Looking really big picture for a moment, we have in North America a very large territory with very sparsely populated, right? And as a result, I mentioned earlier, it's easy to set up your own farm, right? And to do so on your own, right? It's difficult, however, to find laborers, right? Why would you work for me for wages when you can just go off on your own for no cost and set up your own farm in a sense, right? So one of the problems of associated with this massive land availability and cheapness is the inability to command labor. And so very early on, there's, of course, the slave trade had already began before the British colonies were settled here. And a lot of that focuses on sugar and coffee and Latin America and then the Caribbean islands. But because of these economic incentives, people were looking for a labor force to grow their farms and to become a wealthy person, if you will. And the first, it looks like farmers turned in a big way to indentured servants, right? They speak English. They're culturally not too different from you, and it pays for the passage across usually 6 years of labor. If you survive it, you can get your freedom dues and go on in this sense. But really early on, 1619, of course, the first slaves appear in Virginia, Port Comfort, and but it's a fairly, I can describe it at this point as it's a fairly marginal part of the transatlantic slave trade. And it stays pretty small until about 1670, 1680, and that's when indentured servants conditions improve in England, and no one wants to become an indentured servant in British North America anymore, right? It becomes harder to become indentured servants, and people turn to slavery, the slave trade, in a fairly big way. Ultimately, over the course of the transatlantic slave trade, we think the United States ended up receiving about 4% of the slaves transported in the transatlantic slave trade. Yet by about 1850, it has more enslaved persons than the rest of the hemisphere combined. It's because slaves are living here and they die at alarmingly high rates in the Caribbean, where sugar is being manifested. So slavery begins to grow before the cotton gin is invented, around 1800. It's certainly growing, and it's becoming more important after, as I said, 1670, 1680, to where some parts of, let's say, South Carolina are black majority counties. The rice growing districts and others are growing. What's interesting from enslaved demography, if you will, is that the enslaved population here starts to grow by natural means. As I said before, more births than deaths, whereas in the Caribbean they have to keep, if they didn't keep importing new slaves in the slave trade, there would be none left. In a sense, they were dying so quickly. So as a result, what happens here is we can call it sometimes creolization, where the slave population learns to speak English, and they are exposed to, let's say, malaria from the beginnings of their, and have kind of acquired immunities, start living longer. And yes, we have a growth of rapid growth of that slave population. So we get about 500,000, I say we in the United States, about 500,000 enslaved persons in the slave trade, but end up before emancipation, there's probably 10 million enslaved people living in the United States. And of course, they contribute massive amounts of hours to the economy, but they also are this political problem that has to be resolved by American Civil War.
Yeah, and that political problem, that originated during the Constitution Convention. Even before that, people knew it was an issue. They kept kicking the can down the road until eventually it couldn't be ignored any longer. And also, it's just kind of an interesting thought to ponder here and there, is the fact that the basic supply and demand of slavery, and they were looked at as a commodity and not necessarily as humans. And the Caribbean is a prime example of that, where they're subhuman, basically. Like, oh, they're gonna die. Doesn't matter. Let's get as much productivity out of them as possible. We have plenty more coming over from Africa, wherever these slaves were acquired at the time, too. And then you talked about indentured servant. Could you just again talk about what the difference between an indentured servant and a slave is? Because I always had a difficult time kind of knowing the difference between the two of them.
Race is a big difference.
Okay.
Indentured servants are almost entirely white, and enslaved people are almost entirely African descent. And for that reason, slavery is considered the beginnings of racism in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're really intimately connected. But indentured servants are primarily white young men in England, sometimes Germany, a few women who are, I should back up and say, in England there's been population growth and some displacement, and in particular the enclosure laws that made it difficult to farm common areas, and we had a very mobile population, a lot of movement of people into London and bigger cities, and these places were demographic traps. They had really high mortality rates looking for work, and a few of those, so you think some of the kind of runoff, if you will, decided to take their chances here in North America. A lot of the white migrants to North America, maybe more than half, are unfree to some degree. Mm-hmm. Some were felons, some were convicts that were allowed to come to British North America, but most were probably young men who had no better opportunities than to sign an indentured. And typically these were ship captains would make the contract. Someone would and then sell your contract to North America. Ideally, you would agree to working for 4 to 6 years in North America to pay for your passage. And if you survive that passage, you would get some type of freedom dues, which is a new suit of clothes and some hoe and some seed. Mm-hmm. And good luck to you, kind of thing, right? Most of these are driven to Virginia. Virginia tends to attract the most indentured servants, whereas in New England is mostly more of a religious, family-based migration. And so coming to the Chesapeake area, a lot of indentured servants. But they were treated differently from the beginning from the black slaves. There were differences in laws. I mean, they were not free. Your master, if you will, if you were an indentured servant, could punish you, could whip you, and there's interesting legal cases. But slaves were from the beginning quite different, hereditary, in particular.
So neither are good, but you'd much rather be an indentured servant than a slave.
Yes.
And when they came from Europe to North America, was their passage as brutal as the slaves' passage was? It was not nearly the same, where they're not getting crammed into.
They're not the tight packers that you have in the Mid-Atlantic slave trade, with just I've forgotten the mortality figure, something like 30% of the enslaved people on that would die in passage. Yeah, and much lower percentages.
And just the overall, that had been horrible, and all the things that you imagine. But another thing too, people talk the smell that would come from those ships is just unbearable. You could not bear it. It was.
Well, if we could invent a time machine and go back, we'd all be appalled by the smell of any.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Another important part too is in demographics is the American Civil War too. And if we could just talk about what the role demographics played in the American Civil War, maybe how much that aided the North compared to the South, and just the relationship between the two.
Yeah, so it's interesting that most immigrants to the United States, free immigrants in this case, not slave, but the slave trades, by the way, is cut off in 1808 in the United States, but decide to come to northern states. They do not want to compete against slave labor. So as a result, the northern states were growing at a faster demographic rate than southern states. At the beginning, in the Constitutional Convention you mentioned, there's roughly a balance of states where slavery is allowed and slavery is not. And it's just kind of almost random, but it just plays out that as the United States grew, the number of slave states grew about the same number as the number of free states, and it was always fairly balanced. And as a result, the Senate was always balanced. between senators from slave states, and it could be one more free state than slave state, or the same number. These kinds of things, right? But as new territories acquired from the Mexican-American War, and more states are being carved out, it becomes clear that the North's population advantage is going to play a big role in electing future presidents, and to the point where Abraham Lincoln can be elected president without even being on the ballot in southern states, right? And that is a consequence of demographic growth in the North, exceeding that in the South.
And also, wasn't there the splitting of votes too? With there's 4 candidates in 1860 election too, but nonetheless, still, he was able to get the majority, even though it was like under 50%, but still a majority.
That's right.
Yeah, that's interesting too, to think about that as well.
So demographic growth drives the coming of the war and the outcome, of course, itself, right?
Yeah, because they could just keep putting more and more bodies on the front lines, and then eventually
numbers play out.
Yeah, and they allow African Americans to fight too.
That's right.
And the South would never have something like that because they were afraid.
They thought about it right at the very end. Robert E. Lee, in desperation, maybe we should be enlisting our slaves to fight for us.
Or they were also afraid of arming people that they had put down for hundreds of years.
That's right.
Too. And you talk about the 1808 with the slave trade being outlawed too. Wasn't also a consequence of that was the people that owned slaves at the time, the value of those slaves increased because the supply was lowered.
Yes, you're very well informed, basically.
Thank you. So that's another thing. It's there's a moral thing to end the slave trade, but also there's another reason behind it.
Because there's positive natural population growth. The slave population is growing too, about 25% per year, not 35% of the white population is growing, but still growing pretty rapidly. And the demand for cotton seems seemingly insatiable, right? The expansion westward. So slave traders are making massive amounts of money, and people who own slaves as well, right?
All right. You also talked about earlier, was it the epidemiological transition too? Maybe if you want to speak about that a little bit, maybe like the germ theory as well, how that kind of came about too.
Sure.
If I'm not mistaken, was the Mayo Clinic kind of have a involvement in that? And this, I remember hearing somewhere is like they used to wash the scalpels before using them on different people too, and I guess that's kind of a consequence out of the germ theory. But you know a little bit more about that than I do.
Well, I don't know nothing about the Mayo Clinic's involvement in the demographic transition, but I'm sure they're participants. Yeah. I don't know if they're drivers necessarily. Yeah. So what we mean by I talked about the demographic transition from high death rates to low death rates, but what's really interesting is the things people die from are changing. And before the demographic transition, people are dying, for the most part, of infectious disease. These are the primary killers. It's influenza, malaria, typhus, typhoid, dysentery, massive, tuberculosis. After the transition, those are the things that are not banished completely, but are being fought with public health movement, which is so critical. It's not medicine, it's public health, and preventing the transmission and contracting of these infectious disease that ends up increasing life expectancy. And so what you see is afterwards people are dying from more degenerative diseases, things like cancer or heart disease, these things, right? It's not that those rates are going up of those things. It's not like, cancer rates have gone up. It's just that they're not dying from other things, right? People living long enough to acquire cancer and die from that. So that's what we call the epidemiological transition. It tells you something about how people, what was driving the demographic transition. And it is, I think, public health. It is, in terms of actual what medicine can do to, cure you, not much. There's a few odds and ends here and there. Diphtheria had some kind of antitoxin theory and other things, but it's understanding infection and how to fight it. So you mentioned Civil War and deaths. The number one killer of Civil War soldiers is diarrhea.
Yeah.
Which is not a disease. It's a symptom.
Yeah.
Dysentery is, you can say, maybe is a disease that has some type of known causative agent, although sometimes we don't know if it's bacteria or viral or, and which is incredible. Kills more people than bullets, and it's a terrible way to die.
Yeah.
You die from really dehydration. And one of the great inventions of the 20th century is oral rehydration therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Gatorade stuff, right?
Electrolytes.
Just have done so much to prevent early death from, especially in childhood. So that's the epidemiological transition. I think maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I got one more question here. I think you have a fun time answering this. I know I certainly have strong opinions about this, but you study history and you understand the importance. So, why, in your opinion, why do you think studying history is important?
Oh, I like to think, first of all, that you shouldn't have to justify it. That history is important in its own right. That understanding where we've been, kind of thing, tells us something of who we are. But also, these lessons of history is sometimes being held up as, and I don't want to overplay that, because we live in a very different world than people in the past lived in. But it gives you an appreciation, I think, of possibilities, of accomplishments. It can be inspirational. It can be educational. It's just the human story. It just has so much ability to just inspire you, awe you, shock you, and surprise you. I love it myself. I don't want to oversell it, right? It's people don't come out with history degrees and go and say, what's my career option? But I think it's still a wonderful liberal arts education. It teaches you to write, to think critically. In particular, I think it's learning to deal with source material in a skeptical way, which all professional historians have to do. We've got just remnants of the past before us. We see it imperfectly, right? And developing methods to approach this really rich source of information and to learn from it develops really nice critical thinking and reasoning skills. I wish we had more students. It looks like we're losing majors. People are being attracted to STEM fields, and I get that. I was attracted myself.
Yep.
But yet I hope, I love what I do. I love it. And am I saving the world? No. I'm not making the paper industry more efficient than it could perhaps be, which is a loss to the paper industry, I think. But I am so glad I made that transition. I feel so much more personally enriched by it, and the discovery of the past. How lucky I am to be involved in it.
Absolutely. And whether people learn history through formal education or kind of like you did before, just reading books, there's so many great books out there that can really inspire and motivate you to want to keep learning history. And I'll just harp on the point you made, the perspective you can get on how life was back in begin 1776 or antiquity, and then just how great life is now.
Let me plug one book real quick. Kyle Harper just wrote a book on the history of disease, and I think we had this sense that we were immune from disease, right? But human populations evolve. Our pathogens are always evolving, and we see COVID right now as one of those examples of how we can learn from history and how this fight's never over.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Hacker, I know you're busy. I'll let you get back to work, but thank you for your time.
All right, Mason, thanks.
Thank you for listening to Youthful Perspectives. Of the many things I learned from this conversation, one of the most profound ideas I took away is that demographic history is human history. From the first transition of isolated nomadic tribes to permanent agricultural societies, to the dreadful centuries during the Dark Ages, to the rebirth of ancient ideals during the Renaissance, and the revolutionary modes of thought throughout the Enlightenment, up until the exponential growth of human knowledge, innovation, and interconnectedness between the long 19th century to today. The advancements we reap in the present have been made possible from the tireless work of those in the past. It's important we acknowledge how fortunate we are to be alive during this point in human history, and we should be inspired to contribute to the advancements our forebears have made, so that humanity's tree of endless knowledge continues to grow indefinitely. This is Mason Beerbaum, signing off.